Hi there, and welcome to Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. My name is Joshua Bissell, and I'm the editor of this weekly podcast where we tackle topics around abuse prevention and vulnerable sector protection. Thank you so much for joining us for this series on addressing common gaps that we find in policies and procedures for organizations that work with the vulnerable sector. This is our last episode of the series, and Melodie is going to be addressing the last two gaps that we commonly find in policies and procedures. We're going to be starting a new series in a couple weeks, and we're so thankful that you've chosen to spend your time with us today. Please enjoy this episode of Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail." Over the last month and a half, we've been talking about common gaps that we find in policies. And yes, we do find gaps when we review policies. And our goal is to try to help you shore up, strengthen your policies so that you don't fall prey to some of these gaps, which would leave your organization at great risk of liability, but even more so, risk of abuse, injury, or harm happening to those that you really want to protect. Today, we are going to finish up this series, and we're going to talk about two common gaps that we find within organizations when we look at their policies and their procedures. The first one has to do with the fact that the organization does not have a crisis plan in place. There's no reference to a crisis plan or even the forethought that a crisis could happen within your organization. The second gap that we often find is that organizations either take on the responsibility of doing investigations internally when they should not be doing them, or they do not do an investigation when they should be doing them. So today we're going to tackle these two big gaps, and I really encourage you to take our recommendations back to your boards, back to your leadership, and encourage them to be prepared for when a crisis occurs. Let me read for you a definition of the word crisis. A crisis is a condition of instability. It's a danger, a dramatic, emotional, or circumstantial upheaval, a stage and sequence of events in which the trend of all future events, especially for better or worse, is determined. It is a turning point within an organization. A crisis is very different than a problem. We all encounter problems within our organizations. A problem would be when you discover that a staff member is going on emergency maternity leave. A problem is when you discover a volunteer has not been following the code of conduct. Those are problems that come up, and they come up every day within every type of organization. That is very different than a crisis. None of us want to face a crisis. As I said, a crisis is an instability, a dramatic event or a series of events which really throw the whole organization in upheaval. It is a turning point for the organization. When a crisis occurs, we can either face the crisis head on or bury our heads in the sand and pretend that it is not occurring. A crisis would certainly occur if one of your children, youth, or vulnerable adults were abused either physically, sexually, emotionally, or if there was injury or even a fatality. What about a discrimination crisis, a financial crisis, personnel crisis, organizational crisis, or even hearing about historic systemic abuse that has happened within your organization? It could be a technological crisis where someone holds your organization at ransom. It could be a natural crisis that could occur, a confrontational crisis, a workplace violence crisis, or a crisis of slander, where someone speaks ill of your organization and perhaps even takes that to social media. Could be a combination of any of the above. Certainly in the midst of COVID-19, all organizations have experienced some element of a crisis as they face the pandemic. When a crisis occurs, there are many different feelings and reactions that occur. Shock, denial, anger, irritability, feelings of complete hopelessness or failure. Often organization leaders go into deep depression, fear, anxiety, certainly different mood swings. Often we hear of organization leaders that feel completely numb and, as I said, put their heads in the sand and deny that it has even happened. Often when we speak to organizational leaders that are facing a crisis, they feel overwhelming guilt for either hiring an individual that they did not properly screen and train and supervise, that ended up grooming and abusing students within their programs and activities. So the common gap that we often find in relation to this is organizations that do not have a crisis management plan in place. This is common among many organizations. It's because of the tyranny of the urgent seems to want to postpone the development of a crisis plan because you're not facing a crisis at that time. Not having a crisis management plan in place really is not preparing you to be able to deal with that crisis when it occurs. As my good friend Barry Doyle says, it's not if, but when a crisis occurs. Are you prepared if a crisis occurs this very week? Crisis management is the act of preparing ahead of time with a view to shepherding your organization through the crisis as quickly and as completely as possible. That is what crisis management is. It's a plan for organizations so that they can return to their normal procedures and activities as soon as possible. To be able to move through that crisis with as little impact to the organization. But a crisis will cause impact. It's how much impact you actually will endure. So I'm going to provide to you an outline of a crisis management plan that we would recommend that you have. And it may be in a file drawer, it may be on your server, but it's something that you would be able to put your hands on as soon as a crisis occurs or you see indicators that a crisis is about to occur. In your crisis management plan, you would begin with a preamble or a call to action, an executive summary of when this crisis plan would be put into place. The plan would also include some common indicators or triggers that you would notice that would alert you to the fact that, yes, you are facing a crisis. What are some of those first warnings that a crisis is occurring? It may be a phone call. It may be someone that comes into your office that is very angry. It may be a social media post or a social media page that's been developed. It may be someone that has served you with papers that there is a lawsuit pending. Your crisis management plan should provide you all the information you need about the individuals that will sit on your crisis team. We would recommend a team of anywhere up to 7, 8 people that would be sitting around the table helping you manage this crisis. Include in your crisis management plan who those individuals are, why you have invited them to sit at the table. These are people within your organization that may have the skill sets that you need to help you manage the crisis. I would want someone who has strong administrative skills, someone who knows our website and has the technology experience and skills to be able to immediately make changes to the website. It would certainly be individuals that are spokespeople who can speak to media. Along with your internal team, you will want to have a team available to you that you can call on in the midst of a crisis. This could include your lawyers, your insurance agents. It could include individuals that have experience and knowledge in how to deal with promotion and publicity in the midst of a crisis, someone who can help you craft those media statements. It may be denomination leaders or association leaders, individuals that you can call on to help you navigate the waters of this crisis, both for your internal team and your third-party team. You will want to be able to have all the phone numbers, email addresses, all the information so that you can immediately reach out to them. At the point of a crisis, you don't want to have to be scrounging around to find contact information. As part of your crisis management team, you will want to also consider how you will navigate your social media pages and your website. We would recommend that you shut down some of your social media pages or at least restrict access to some of them and your website so that news reporters can't go and dig up additional information that could hurt your organization. We call this having available a dark website, a page that you could immediately post live that would provide your vision, your mission, your purpose as an organization, a little bit about the history of the organization, your organizational chart, or who sits on your board within your organization. On this dark website, you would be able to post your response to the crisis without it being distracted by other content on your website. Then we would encourage you, as part of your crisis plan, to provide templates for the primary types of crisis that your organization could face. Consider, what are the primary types of crisis that your organization could face? Would it be child abuse? Would it be sexual harassment, discrimination, financial crisis? As part of your crisis management plan, have templates with talking points to each one of those potential crises. Part of successfully facing a crisis is knowing how to deal with news reporters and the media. We would recommend that you have media talking points and even guidelines for how you would interact with the media. Remember, the media can become a friend or at least a friendly colleague in the midst of a crisis. Use the media to be able to communicate to your stakeholders and to your community how you are dealing with the crisis and how you are deeply concerned that this even occurred, and that you will work with investigators in quickly resolving this crisis, and that you will make sure that you strengthen the organization and learn from this experience so that you are a stronger organization moving forward. Don't run away from media. Rather, prepare with media talking points so that you can communicate your side, your perspective of what has happened. In the crisis response plan, you will provide guidelines for media when they come onto your property. If you're a church, you certainly would not want the media there on a Sunday morning with their cameras and putting a microphone in front of people's faces. So provide clear guidelines on what media can do and what media cannot do. Also consider within your crisis management plan what activities will be temporarily suspended, and what activities will continue to go forward in the presence of a crisis. We would also encourage you to provide in your crisis management plan a list of media, individuals that you would be able to reach out to so that you would be able to share your side of the story. A crisis management plan is an essential tool for any charity, organization, business. As I said, echoing Barry Doyle's words, it's not if, but when a crisis occurs. So please take time to put a crisis management plan in place so that you can draw on it in the midst of a crisis. Now, the last gap that I want to talk about is when and how to do investigations. We often find this a gap within organizations. We find that organizations want to do their own investigation before they fulfill their duty to report to Child and Family Services. They're doing their own investigation and talking to individuals to try to determine the truth without that investigation being done properly. Please remember that if abuse happens or any sexual assault or misconduct against a minor, you have a legal duty, a moral duty, an ethical duty to report that to Child and Family Services or law enforcement. Minors cannot protect themselves. Please fulfill your duty to report and immediately call Child and Family Services or law enforcement and allow them to do the initial investigation. Don't muddy the waters by talking to individuals until they can first reach out and interview different participants. There is a time for an organization to do an investigation. Now, this can be called an internal investigation, though we would strongly recommend that you do not do this on your own, but bring in a third party to provide that investigation. Here are just some of the best practices when it comes to doing that form of investigation. Now, again, I want to say this is not involving minors. If this crisis involves minors, you must first allow Child and Family Services and law enforcement to do the investigation. Please allow them to do their investigation before you do any type of internal investigation. An investigation's goal is to follow facts objectively and avoid any form of bias. That's why it's so important to bring in an impartial third party who has no bias to discover what transpired. It's to create no further harm. And when an organization does their own internal investigation and starts asking questions and encouraging people to either reconcile, forgive, forget, or lays blame, you are adding further emotional harm to potential victims. You certainly are interfering with justice. An internal investigation with a third-party investigator provides an opportunity for justice and due process for offenders, where an organization would then be able to determine if the individual should be suspended, terminated, or follow progressive steps of discipline. It's not to determine guilt, but rather preponderance of the evidence. Does it appear from the investigation 51% or higher that yes, this did occur and wrongdoing occurred? When you do this type of investigation, make sure that you call on the assistance of experts, either victim assistance experts, child forensic investigators, forensic psychologists, lawyers, or people that have expertise in abuse prevention. and the protection of the vulnerable sector. The purpose, again, is prevention, not blame. After an investigation, employers, organizations are required with any undue delay to take corrective action and then report on the actions taken. Once an investigation occurs, a report would be provided to the organization with recommendations on next steps. Along with your investigative team or inquiry team, determine what part of the report should be communicated to victims. The type of investigations that you may take would be on sexual harassment, discrimination, workplace violence, inappropriate conduct, toxic abuse of power, and child abuse after law enforcement and child and family services have conducted their official investigation. I can remember dealing with a client where child abuse had occurred. The leadership of the organization was very, very certain that abuse and misconduct did occur. It was reported to Child and Family Services, and they were not able to substantiate the abuse. But the organization was still very certain that misconduct did occur. So once Child and Family Services and law enforcement had completed their investigation, the organization conducted their own internal investigation to determine preponderance of evidence. Best practices around investigations provide an opportunity for the victims to be heard. Time is spent with the victims to be able to tell their story, their understanding what occurred, and believed. When we conduct inquiry investigations or interviews at Plan to Protect, we always begin our interviews with, "We are so sorry this happened to you. We are so sorry that you were injured or harmed, and we want to hear your story." You're validating that something happened that caused deep injury to this individual. However, an investigative interview would also provide an opportunity for the accused to be treated with fair process, to hear their side of the story. I recently had the opportunity to sit in on an investigation, and they treated the accused with great respect, built rapport with the individual, asked them about what had transpired. He continued to deny that any misconduct had occurred. But by the end of the interview, the interviewers were able to show him either photographs, text messages, or information that allowed him to feel that he was heard, but also for him to admit that yes, misconduct did occur. Yes, he has broken the code of conduct and has caused harm to the vulnerable sector. That is what your goal is with investigation. Another goal and best practice around investigations relate to the organization treating fairly all the participants, even the staff members that perhaps wrote down incident report forms, either followed means a follow through with care and follow up with the victims and to the accused, or let the ball drop. Throughout the investigation, you want the organization culture to remain as healthy as possible. You want to continue to build trust. You want to continue to raise the bar on protection. Once an investigation is done, as I said, a written report would be prepared and shared with the organization. And from that written report, a summary would be prepared to be able to communicate to those that participated in the investigation what some of the findings were. You don't have to share the full report because there are certainly going to be some recommendations in that report that relate to HR issues that should be kept confidential, but certainly to validate the concerns of the victims and to voice the organization's commitment to protection moving forward. In conclusion, as part of the investigation, I just want to say it's really important not to project your expectations on the victims. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I know so many of our clients are faith-based organizations, and you hold the value and the theological importance of forgiveness. You can do a great amount of emotional harm if you ask a victim to forgive the person that abused them until the process of healing begins. It is a lifelong journey to heal from sexual abuse or any form of abuse, injury, or harm. Yes, our scriptures may tell us that we are to forgive those that wrong against us. I cannot forgive someone who abused you. I can show grace. I can show love and care to that individual, but they did not wrong me. They did not harm me. Part of the healing journey of abuse and wrongdoing is grieving over what had happened and what was stolen from that individual. Part of the healing process is lament. Part of that healing process is learning new practices and discovering safe people in their life who will sit and listen and care. Part of the healing process is finding therapeutic counseling by professionals that can help that person walk through the trauma they experienced. We can do grave damage to an individual by insisting that they forgive and that they reconcile with the person that abused them. Please do not include that in your investigation. An investigation is not telling people what they should do or what they should not do. It is asking questions where there is no bias, allowing individuals to tell you their stories, and then taking that information, putting it into a report with recommendations moving forward. An investigation should never be used to correct people's behavior in the midst of the investigation, but rather to listen to what transpired and then to determine the path forward. As we finish up today and we finish up this series, I want to end with a challenge for each one of you. Please conduct a policy audit on your policies and your procedures. We've provided 10, 12, 14 different common gaps that we find in policies. Let's not rest on our laurels. The best way for you to determine if some of these gaps are part of your organization is for you to conduct a policy audit. This is a service that we offer at Plan to Protect, and we encourage you on an annual or every 2 years, conduct a policy audit. We'd be happy to walk through this with you. We've got webinars on our school on how to conduct a policy audit. I'd much rather do a policy audit and identify the gaps within your policies rather than to be called up and said, Melodie, will you help us with an investigation? We want to help prevent abuse, injury, and harm from happening. So we encourage you, conduct a policy audit, identify how many of these gaps your organization currently is facing, and let's shore up those policies, those procedures, that crisis management plan, so that you are prepared to both avoid injury and harm and abuse, but also to deal properly if there is an incident, there is a crisis, with your crisis management plan in place so that you can move through that storm as quickly and seamlessly as possible. Thanks so much for joining me for this series. Looking forward to talking to you next week. Take care, everyone.